go to see the monument, but it kind of no longer really exists, and he can explain that to you. It is the only Revolutionary War battle that was held in Cape May County. So, in light of our 250th coming up, and as I remind people when we talk about the events that we do, there's going to be 8 to 10 years worth of 250th. It's not just 1776 to 2026. For example, the Boston Massacre was in 73. That already happened. The 250th of that happened in 2023. So there's a lot of Revolutionary War things happening over the next 8 years. So take it away, John.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here again. My name is John. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Historic Cold Spring Village, and the Battle of Turtle Gun Inlet is kind of near and dear to us because it happened fairly close to where the village is today. Now, just north of where the entrance to Cold Spring Harbor, or Cold Spring Inlet is, which is now Cape May Harbor, there used to be a small inlet leading into the back bays of what is now Wildwood and Wildwood Crest. At the dawn of the Revolutionary War, and especially as you can see in this nice little diagram here, this island here, most of the back bays and the islands up that we know today as Wildwood, Stone Harbor, Avalon, were all uninhabited. Most of the land there was owned by the original whaling families that had settled the county in the late 1680s into the early 1700s. And most of the population had lived inland, but they basically used a lot of these inland inlets and the islands primarily to graze their cattle. They'd bring them over in the summertime, let them graze all summer long, and bring it back from the farms when they needed them. But for one small day, right at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Cape May County had a prominent role to play for one day. Battle is often overlooked by history books. We're going to get into a little bit about what happened in the battle, why it's often overlooked, and then what happened to Turtle Gun Inlet itself. First, we're going to set the stage. So obviously, the battle happens on June 29th, 1776, so 249 years ago, a few days ago. Next year will be the 250th anniversary of the battle. So, leading up to it, obviously, the Revolutionary War starts at Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 75. The Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. And a little side note, there might have been representatives from Cape May at the Continental Congress, if it weren't the fact that one of them actually died a little early. There were two prominent politicians in Cape May, Jacob Spicer and Aaron Leeming, who were descendants of the original whaling families. And they were members of the New Jersey legislature, and one of the things they had done in the lead up to this time period is put together a document called the Concessions and Agreements, which is a big volume cutting all the colonial laws up to that point. It was published in the early 1750s, 1760s. Unfortunately, one of them died in the 1760s, the other one had financial and health problems leading up to it, so they were not actually selected to go up to the Continental Congress. And Cape May being as isolated as it usually is because of our geography in the area, all the salt marshes and cranberry bogs and the pine barrens between here and Philadelphia, make it a little difficult to get back and forth. One of the things we talk about at Cold Spring Village is that the average travel to Cape May by stagecoach took 2 days, so it wasn't exactly an easy place to get back and forth to. So it was pretty isolated, but fiercely independent. The people in Cape May at the time were very much in favor of independence. There was only one known Tory in the area. He was the tax collector. He was not a very popular person. He was eventually run out of town and his lands were seized. So in the lead up, the Continental Congress meets. After that, George Washington assumes command of the Army of Bunker Hill, and Robert is at the reenactment for the Battle of Bunker Hill. And soon after, basically about almost a year later, after the Battle of Ticonderoga, where basically the colonial forces seized the cannons, dragged them all the way to Boston, surrounded the city of Boston on the Dorchester Heights, the British decided to evacuate Boston, and they decided to regroup in Halifax. In the meantime, they started blockading American ports. Now, this is a very small blockade at first because the British are still kind of reorganizing themselves, trying to determine how they want to blockade. So by 1778, There are 32 ships that are going to be blockading most of American ports, but right now in the Delaware Bay, it's only about 2 or 3. So basically, once the British evacuate Boston, the Continental Army departs Massachusetts, to fortify New York City, which George Washington believes is going to be where the British are going to strike next. And that plays an important role, partially as to why Turtle Gut is kind of overlooked a lot. So, this kind of sets the stage for the battle. Basically, the British had posted the Prohibitory Acts, banning trade, basically authorizing the seizure of all ships coming in and out of American ports, seizing the goods, in order to make sure those supplies did not reach the Continental Army, reach the colonies, and that kind of thing. And of course, down here in Cape May, we have a history of privateering and smuggling. So basically, a lot of people involved in the Cape May shipping areas were involved in the trade of smuggling. So what happened was that the British blockade the Delaware Bay. Now this map is sideways. So basically Cape May is down here at the bottom. This Cape Henlopen and Delaware over on that side over there. So basically you're looking at it at a west being north up top of the map. So there's only 2 or 3 ships of the British blockading the Delaware Bay. And really at that point that's all they kind of really need. Because Delaware Bay, as you can see here, it's still to this day, there's a lot of shallows and shoals all through it. So you need experienced pilots and navigators who know their way around the bay, through the shallows to make their way up the bay and up the river. So cutting off the opening of the bay between Cape Henlopen and Cape May was fairly easy for a couple of ships to handle.
Sure.
The privateers and the smugglers in Cape May would often basically try and either go into the bays or around the point onto the Delaware Bay side and kind of work their way up the coast. So that was one way the local privateers and smugglers in the Cape May area were able to avoid the British blockade and get supplies up to Philadelphia. The other thing they did was that in Philadelphia, the colonists actually blockaded the Delaware River itself to make sure British ships could not make their way up to Philadelphia and bombard the city. So what they did was they installed, and again my French is terrible, but that's what they're called. And basically there are large spikes planted in the Delaware River, all up and down in the approaches to Philadelphia. You see at the top of that picture, that's the Schuylkill. So it's right up, basically around where the airport is today. And part of the reason we know they were there, one, this is a Hessian diagram showing where from 1777, showing where these spikes were, but also recently in the last 10 years or so after Hurricane Sandy, some of these spikes washed ashore. They were still in the bottom of the bay. So one of the ones that was found was a 29-foot long pole with a metal spike on top that basically was there to kind of damage British ships. So basically, if you didn't know where they were and you tried to navigate up the river, you ran the risk of running into one of these barriers. Right? So there's several people in Philadelphia involved with the creation of those, Ben Franklin being one of them as well. So these smugglers had ways to get around the shoals and the sandbars, and they also knew where these barricades were, so there were ways to getting supplies to the colonists. Of course, one of the big things they need was gunpowder. They need supplies to get to the Continental Army. So, this gentleman here, Robert Morris, member of the Continental Congress from Philadelphia, signed the Declaration of Independence. He's basically known as the financer of the Revolution. His job was to make sure the Continental Army got the supplies they needed. He was in charge of obtaining gunpowder. So one thing he does, early in 1776, he has a friend named Hugh Montgomery, who just became captain of a ship, a brand new ship called the Nancy. It was a brig built in Delaware. So he commissions Captain Montgomery and the Nancy to go down to the Caribbean and obtain supplies in what is today the U.S. Virgin Islands, but back then it was controlled by the Dutch. So the Nancy sets sail in March, April, heads down to the Caribbean. And there's a picture of the brig, Nancy in St. Thomas. It's a proud-looking ship. So it arrives in St. Thomas and St. Croix, and by late June it is ready to sail back to Philadelphia with a cargo of 386 barrels of gunpowder, 55 muskets, 101 hogsheads of rum, very important, and 62 hogsheads of sugar to make more rum. You wonder why the rum? Well, rum was a popular drink. People trusted it more than the water. Right? And America was very fond of alcohol. By the 1820s, the United States was known as the drunkest nation on earth. John Adamson, for instance, had a daily habit of drinking about 5 pints of rum daily. There was a woman, a historian who did a book about drinking in America, who tried to replicate John Adams' drinking habits. He would have a pint of rum in the morning with breakfast. He would have one mid-afternoon before his afternoon walk. He'd have one with lunch. He'd have one with dinner. And have one at the end of the day. She tried to copy that schedule. She lasted about 2 or 3 days and said, done, can't do it. So anyway, the rum was very important. This is all of those supplies were. Now, at this point, we have to pause a little bit and talk a little bit about the myths and the history and how they get intertwined in this. Because a lot of what we know, we have some facts, but we have a lot of mythology and folklore coming along with this. Much of what we know about Hugh Montgomery and the Nancy and their trip comes from Hugh Montgomery's daughter, Elizabeth Montgomery. No relation to the Bewitched Star. That I know of anyway. So one of the things that Elizabeth claims is that the Nancy, as you see here in this etching, was the first American ship to fly the Stars and Stripes in a foreign port. According to stories and legends, and family tales that went on, that while the Nancy was in St. Thomas, they had gotten word of independence, and so Captain Montgomery commissions one of his young ensigns to create an American flag based on the descriptions that they were given at the time. And then that flag was proudly displayed at a dinner that was held on board the Nancy with the governor of the island, when there was a 13-gun salute held during the dinner, and the flag was unveiled. There are several problems with this story. One, the Nancy is there in late June. Obviously, a Declaration of Independence hadn't been signed yet. Also, at that point in time, the American flag hadn't really been described yet. The American flag doesn't get officially described for another year. Flag Day 1777 is when Congress declares what the American flag is supposed to look like. So we don't know what the flag, probably if they did have a flag there, it was probably the Continental colors or the Grand Union flag, which was the stripes, but in the canton was the British Union Jack, which was the flag that George Washington had commissioned to have for the Army as a way of showing that the colonies were united in their purposes, but having the British Union Jack on there was also kind of an olive branch to say, yes, we are fighting for our rights, but we consider ourselves Englishmen. We just want our rights as Englishmen, but obviously once the fighting starts, the flag has to change, but that's another whole story. Now, other problem with this. Elizabeth recounts this story in her memoir. The memoir is called Reminiscences of Wilmington in Familiar Village Tales, Ancient and New. It was written in 1851, 70 some odd years after the events she's describing. She also never knew her father. She was pretty much an infant when Hugh Montgomery died. We'll get into how he dies later on. And even this picture here and this engraving here are both created for her book. So she's relying on family history. Also, she's relying on the tales of the descendants of that particular young ensign, who was 17 at the time. So there's another story that comes back down from this through the years, through that young ensign's grandson, who writes a tale of his own in 1898, 122 years later. And even he's like, yeah, I'm not really sure this is actually the way things happened. It is kind of snowballed through family tales through time. But both these stories are interesting because they both play into the stories of the origin of the American flag. Because both these stories were used by a man named William Canby. Anyone ever heard of the name William Canby? William Canby was Betsy Ross's grandson. In 1870, he was attending a meeting of the Pennsylvania Historical Society, and they were getting ready for the centennial celebration of American independence, just like we are getting ready for the semi-quincentennial, the 250th. Try saying that 5 times fast. But basically means halfway to 500. So, William Canby, they're compiling all these stories about the Revolution. He says, my grandmother made the first American flag. And that is how Betsy Ross's story came into the American consciousness. Prior to that, Betsy Ross was known in Philadelphia. She was a seamstress. She made canvas and flags and sails for the American colonies, for the Army, for the Navy. We just don't know for certain if Jackson made the very first American flag. That's a little bit of mythology and whatnot that, again, is another entire story. But of course, again, independence is not declared until July 4th, or actually July 2nd, but the two accounts kind of snowball together and become part of the mythology of the American flag. So we have a lot of mythology and folklore going into this. But we do know that Nancy was down in the Virgin Islands at that time, acquiring supplies, and in late June, they were on their way back up to Philadelphia. Okay. So, now we get to the point where we have the chase. So, the Nancy's coming back up the coast. They're going to need to go up the Delaware Bay to Philadelphia. They are going to need help, and William Morris knows they're going to need help. So he enlists the help of someone who was just commissioned in the Continental Navy, a man by the name of John Barry, who was a young, at this point, this is an older picture of him, was a young captain who had just been given commission of the USS Lexington, small brigantine. He was also an old friend of Hugh Montgomery, so he knew what he was up to and what he was doing. So basically, John Barry's job was to harass the British ships that were blockading the Delaware Bay and trying to do what he could to help the privateers and the smugglers get the supplies up the bay into Philadelphia. Now, one of the things that both Morris and Barry knew was that the Nancy was a very small group, a very small boat, had a crew of 11 and only 6 guns. So not a very big ship against whatever British warships were there. So Barry, like I said, had the USS Lexington, which was kind of impressive, than a brigantine vessel. All right, she was a 86-foot-long ship with 14 guns. Okay. Looks kind of impressive from here, but kind of keep in mind the small size of 86 feet. All right, there were 2 other ships that were working with Barry and Lexington, the USS Wasp and the USS Reprisal. Okay, the Reprisal was 100 feet long and 18 guns. Her captain was a man by the name of Lambert Wicks from the eastern shore of Maryland. And then there was the USS Wasp, captained by John Baldwin. She was 74 feet long, had 14 guns. So we got some more firepower. But again, keep in mind, these pictures look impressive. They look like they're big ships of the line, but they're not. They're very small vessels. So by way of comparison, if you were to go down to Cape May to the Coast Guard base down there right now, there are 3 87-foot patrol boats that are stationed in Cape May. They look like that. So imagine that. That's basically what the Continental Navy has to defend shipping against the British blockade. Something about that size. So what did the British have? Well, like I said, the British blockade was not at full strength yet, but they had 3 fairly good-sized ships. The lead ship was this one, the HMS Liverpool. Right? She's 118 feet long, 28 guns. Okay. There were 2 other vessels with them. Okay. The HMS Orpheus and the HMS Kingfisher. The Orpheus was 130 feet long, 32 guns. The Kingfisher, 97 feet long, 16 guns. Okay. So basically, we're outgunned at least 2 to 1. Now, what the American vessels lacked in size, they made up for in maneuverability. Right? They had the ability to go into these shallow inlets and avoid the shoals that the British vessels could not get through. And again, why only 3 vessels? If it's so important for the British to blockade American shipping into Philadelphia and cut off supplies, why are they only doing this with 3 ships? Well, remember, the British had evacuated Boston and they were regrouping in Halifax, eventually to strike New York. And this comes into why the Battle of Trafalgar Inlet often gets overlooked because the day before this battle happens, the British show up in New York Harbor. Right off Staten Island, where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge is today, first ships appear in what would eventually become the largest amphibious assault in history to that point in time. When the entire British fleet was assembled, they had 32,000 soldiers, 10,000 sailors, 330 warships, all amassed, ready to strike and land on Long Island, which they eventually would do. Okay. So needless to say, the little events happening in Cape May are a little blip on the radar, which didn't even exist yet, compared to the scale of events happening just up the coast. So, what actually happens? So late in the day on the 28th of June, one of the British warships spots the Nancy off Cape Henlopen and starts to pursue it. This one is the Orpheus, and eventually joined by the Kingfisher. And soon after that, there's an American lookout in Cape May that spots the vessels giving chase, signals John Barry on the Lexington by flag signals. It's late in the day, and they know they can't do much at this point in time, so what John Barry does, he convenes a council. So he and the captain of the Wasp and the Reprisal, they all get together and decide what they're going to do. And it's dark, and they figure the best course of action is that, looking at the weather, they realize it's a very light wind that day. It's going to be a light wind the following morning. So they know they can't raise sail out and engage the British warships and harass them so the Nancy can squeeze by into the shoals. So what they decide to do is that John Barry tells the captain, Lambert Wicks, of the Reprisal, to launch their longboats, their rowboats, and row towards the Nancy and take control of the Nancy. At this point in time, that Lambert Wicks' brother, Richard, 31 years old, eager to prove himself as a patriot, begs his brother, please let me lead the longboat. Let me lead the person who takes our longboat and goes to the Nancy. Lambert Wicks thinks about it, kind of reluctant, says, okay, fine, you can take the lead longboat. So, the plan is they're going to take the longboat, beat the Nancy. So this happens under cover of darkness early in the morning of the 29th. The plan is they're going to take the Nancy into Turtle Gut Inlet, which you can see right there just north of Cold Spring Inlet. So most of what we're talking about here, most of the facts we know about Turtle Gut Inlet come from John Barry's logs and Lambert Wicks's correspondence and whatnot. Most of this comes from a book called John Barry, an American Hero, written by Tim McGrath, an author who has
We love him.
who has spoken many
He's
times in
spoken here
Old Spring Village.
before.
Yep, so
Yeah.
I got to give credit where credit is due.
Yes.
Yep. Because it's probably one of the most detailed accounts of Turtle Gut Inlet I can find. I know there's a very popular book on Cape May County history, written by, I can't remember his first name, his name is Dowart. Turtle Gut Inlet gets 2 lines in that book. There are other books of local history where it says a brief mention here and there. Tim McGrath gives a very nice detailed account based on John Barry's logs and records. So that morning there's a heavy fog. Richard Wilkes boards the Nancy, directs them into Turtle Gut Inlet and fog, and the idea is they're going to run the boat aground and offload as much of the cargo as they possibly can, because they know in the shoals they can avoid the British. They can't make it directly up through the bay, so they're going to go into Turtle Gut Inlet and they're going to offload as much as they can once they run aground. So soon after Richard Wilkes boards the Nancy, John Barry comes along with longboats from the Lexington and the Wasp and takes command of the action. What ends up happening is they form a bucket brigade. They start taking all the supplies out of the hold of the Nancy, bringing it ashore in what is now the Wildwood Crest area. By 8:30, the British are close enough to begin bombarding. So, as they're offloading, the cannon fire from the British, which are still fairly decent distance offshore, start being heard. Within half an hour, they're in closer range, and the Nancy starts getting blasted to pieces. And there's a good half hour to an hour-long bombardment, while the crew of the Wasp, the Reprisal, the Lexington, and the Nancy are all working together to get as much of these supplies off as possible. This goes on for about an hour. And in the course of that hour, only one American sailor is mildly injured, even though the ship's being blasted to pieces. So, eventually, by about 9:30 or so, Barry realizes the British are getting closer. Eventually, they're going to be launching their own longboats to try and attack and seize and capture the Nancy as a war prize. So it's at this point, John Barry develops an alternate plan. He's going to set a trap, which what I kind of refer to as the Wile E. Coyote movement of the American Revolution. At this point, they have taken all but about 120 of the barrels of gunpowder off the Nancy. So what John Barry does, he orders 40 of the barrels placed in the captain's cabin. He then takes one of the Nancy's sails, strings it along the deck, fills it with gunpowder, and turns it into a fuse. He then orders abandon ship. Right? So all the crew are jumping over the side, getting onto land, getting off the ship. At the very last moment, one of the crew of the Nancy goes up and grabs the flag off the mast, lowers the flag, saving the Continental colors. The British see that as a sign of surrender. So like, huzzah, we've won. The longboats get launched. They row to the Nancy, and just as they are boarding the Nancy, the fuse hits the gunpowder, creating an explosion that supposedly was heard in Philadelphia. Now, you have to imagine 120 some odd barrels of gunpowder suddenly going up in a blast. So the British reported the loss of the Kingfisher's master's mate and 6 men, although the actual death toll was probably a lot higher. There was a report by John Barry to the Continental Congress that once the blast had settled and everyone was kind of over being shocked and stunned by the deafening sound of the explosion, let's see. The blast sent men, boats, and pieces of the Nancy 30 to 40 yards into the sky. And as everything settled, the gory details were made clear as 11 bodies, 2 laced hats, and a leg fell back into the water. Now, once everyone was kind of recovered, like the Americans regathered themselves back on the land, the British, who survived this explosion, retreat and go back to their ships, and they fire one final cannonade towards the Americans on shore. That cannon, one of those cannonballs, hits Richard Wilkes in the arm and chest, killing him, just as his brother Lambert arrives on shore. So Lambert got to see his brother die. He ends up being Richard becomes the only American casualty of the battle. So at this point, the British gather their forces, move back off Cape Henlopen, realizing they have lost this particular encounter, and the Americans briefly celebrate. Now, whether or not this explosion was actually heard in Philadelphia is another matter of debate and mythology. You would think that if there was an explosion that loud, heard that far, somebody locally would have reported it in a paper somewhere. No mention of it. In fact, the only reason we know of this story of it being heard in Philadelphia, 1 week later, a story about it appears in a newspaper in Connecticut. And that's where they say it was heard in Philadelphia. Nobody in Cape May reported in any of the local newspapers or any journals hearing this deafening. I'm not saying it didn't happen. 120 barrels of gunpowder going up is going to make a loud noise. So, again, it's just one of those things that kind of gets snowballed through mythology and legend and folklore. All in all, they saved 256 barrels of gunpowder, 50 muskets, 2 3-pound cannons, a bunch of swords, and 1,000 pounds of dry goods. Okay. We don't know if the rum was part of those dry goods, but that's what's reported to the Continental Congress. What cannot be questioned is the bravery, of course, of the crew of the Nancy, along with the men on the Lexington, the Wasp, and the Reprisal, John Barry's leadership, and of course the tragic loss of Richard Wilkes. And one thing to keep in mind, it doesn't sound like necessarily a lot. It's a good amount of gunpowder, but this is the same time that the British are about to strike New York. Right? Shortly after they arrive on Long Island, off Staten Island, there's a major amphibious assault. They move across Long Island, the Battle of Long Island, Battle of New York, chasing Washington's army all the way up Manhattan to the very top, Fort Lee area, and they then evacuate across New Jersey, eventually crossing the Delaware into Pennsylvania. It's theoretically possible that these supplies that were saved by the crew of the Lexington Wasp Reprisal could have made their way to George Washington, because they did make it up to Philadelphia. And it could have helped Washington's army survive that much longer in order to get across New Jersey. Basically, what we do know is that once everything was settled down, all those munitions were boarded up or put up on the Wasp. The Wasp kind of snuck their way through the back bays around Cape May Point, through the shoals, and made its way up to Philadelphia. So we do know the supplies made their way to the Continental Army. So, the aftermath. What happened to those people involved? Okay. Richard Wilkes is buried about 100 yards or 200 yards away from Cold Spring Village. Down Seashore Road from historic Cold Spring Village is Cold Spring Presbyterian Church. If you ever drive that area, it's kind of a red brick building. That church is one of the oldest churches in Cape May County. The original parish dates to 1712. The building that's there now is the third structure on the site, but that cemetery holds some of the oldest graves in Cape May County, of some of the descendants of the original settlers. So, once they collected all their materials together, they brought Richard Wilkes' body ashore, took him to Cold Spring Presbyterian Church, where a funeral was held for him. Lambert Wilkes comments that the minister said some very nice words, and his body was committed to the cemetery. Now, his actual grave has moved since the original time. There is now a Veterans Field of Honor, a military veteran cemetery at Cold Spring Presbyterian. When that cemetery was dedicated, it was dedicated to Richard Wilkes. Right. So they moved his body from the original grave, which is closer to the church, to the grave where he currently is, and that is his grave marker. Right. The first naval casualty of the American Revolution in New Jersey, and the only American casualty of the Battle of Turtle Gut Inlet. So if you actually go to that grave, go to that cemetery, I believe this is just to the left of the Veterans Field of Honor. That is actually his. So one of many veterans that are buried there. A little side note that I went to visit his grave not too long ago. Interesting side note, the grave just to the right of his is a Cape May resident. It's not an actual grave, it's just a grave marker, a marker stone for a person from World War II that was on board the USS Indianapolis. If anyone remembers this, Jaws and Quint telling the story of the Indianapolis, apparently there was a person from Cape May that was among the lost of the Indianapolis. So, as for some of the other heroes of the battle, so Richard Wilkes' brother Lambert went back to sea on board the Reprisal, continued to serve in the Continental Navy until October 1st, 1777, when the Reprisal was lost at sea off Newfoundland, with the loss of all hands with the exception of the cook, who was able to retell the story. Captain Montgomery, captain of the Nancy, he eventually goes back to sea, continues his role as a privateer until he's eventually captured by the British, right? Which is not a good thing. Those of you who know American Revolutionary War history, a lot of when the British captured American soldiers and sailors, many of them spent a lot of time on prison barges in New York Harbor. Okay? Hugh Montgomery was among those. He was eventually released in 1780 and did eventually go back to sea, but he was never the same again after that experience in the prison barges. In fact, shortly after his release, he was on a voyage back from the Bahamas when, according to the ship's records, his mind became disordered and he dove overboard and was never seen again. And for many years, his daughter Elizabeth fought to have a pension installed in his memory for his service to the American Revolution and the American colonies. Right? It's a long battle, but eventually Congress decided to grant a pension to him. Congress provided a payment of $5,000 to his family if the funds were available in 1858. So if you think Congress moves slow today, it's a long-standing tradition. And then, of course, there's the big hero of the battle, John Barry, who history knows more as Commodore Barry, okay? One of the founders of the American Navy. And he continued to serve throughout the American Revolution, and along with John Paul Jones, is known as one of the fathers of the U.S. Navy. And when the U.S. Navy was officially founded after the war, George Washington granted him and John Paul Jones two of the very first commissions in the United States Navy. And I kind of gave my slide away there. Most of us in New Jersey know him for the bridge. But that bridge is in a prominent location to commemorate his history. Because one of his primary roles, if you talk about with the Nancy, was to harass British ships and protect the approaches into Philadelphia. So that bridge, in his honor, is actually where he would have served during the course of the war. Many things. So, a lot of good history, but that leaves one final thing to talk about. What actually happened to Turtle Gut Inlet? Because like I said, it doesn't exist anymore. So here's a chart showing Turtle Gut Inlet in 1904. And it's a very narrow entrance into this Back Bay area. And over time, it gets shallower and shallower. Here it is in 1925. You can see the depth there, the main entrance quickly goes to 6 feet. Okay? Not very easy for ships to get in and out of. By the 1920s, you have the first aerial photograph of it, and you can see very shallow, not much room to maneuver in there. And then at the same time, and again, if you look at this picture of 7 Mile Beach here, by this period in time, the barrier islands are starting to become populated. Right? By the 1880s, 1890s, people are realizing that this is a great area to come down on vacation. I mean, people knew this Cape May was a good vacation spot for centuries. Actually, one of the earliest known records of a tourist ad for Cape May comes from 1767. There's an ad in the Lower Township paper advertising a house for sale in Lower Township, and part of the ad says that it's a great place, it's a mile from the beach, and it's a great place to take in people who want to enjoy bathing in the ocean. So 10 years before the Revolutionary War, at least, people were coming to Cape May for a vacation. And as the population grew, and more people came down and realized what kind of a hidden gem we were, they started building more and more beach towns and more beach houses, and they needed more room. So as Wildwood starts growing, they need space for more houses, so they filled in Turtle Gut Inlet. 1931, it's totally filled in because they wanted more room to build houses. There it is in the 1930s before the houses went up, but it was totally filled in. However, you can still find where it currently is. You are driving through Wildwood Crest on Pacific Avenue. When you cross Toledo Avenue, that would be the entrance to Turtle Gut Inlet. So that's Toledo Avenue right about here. Right? And now, what the inlet that was Turtle Gut is now known as Sunset Lake. And there's very little in that area that actually indicates that anything was ever there prior to it. There's a little deli right about there called the Turtle Gut Deli. Okay? That's one of the few indicators that there was anything else here before Sunset Lake. People probably went, why is it called Turtle Gut Deli? But thankfully, there is a marker commemorating the battle. So right about in this spot right here, you will find this marker, and the Turtle Gut Inlet Memorial. There's actually 2 markers for this. There's one here right at where Turtle Gut Inlet would have been. There's also another marker commemorating Richard Wilkes in Cape May. If you're ever over in Cape May, right across from, I can't remember the name of the liquor store, but right on Lafayette. Colliers, thank you. You think I wouldn't? I think I remember that one. Right across from Collier's Liquor, right in the entrance to Lafayette Park there's a small plaque on the ground. It's right at the entrance to that, commemorating Richard Wilkes. But on this placard, dedicated June 29th, 1776, almost 250 years ago, a memorial to the seamen and officers of the brigantine Nancy, who for one brief moment brought the American Revolution to Cape May County. Now, Cape May County itself doesn't have a whole lot of activity throughout the war itself. There's a lot of smuggling going on, a lot of that kind of activity going on. Members of the Cape May militia were active throughout the war, but primarily here in the county. After the Battle of Brandywine, there are some members of the Cape May militia that fight at Germantown. But after that, the Board of Freeholders decides that they wanted the militia to stay in Cape May, because there was a big fear that the British, as they're patrolling up and down the shore, are going to be raiding the coast for food and supplies. So the Cape May militia spends most of the Revolutionary War in Cape May County, protecting the county from potential raids from the British, which is a role they also played during the War of 1812. So that pretty much wraps things up. Again, if you were looking for more information about Turtle Inlet or that time period, I recommend these 3 books. And does anyone have any questions? Thank you all for coming out.
There's a Commodore John Barry Irish Center up in Mount Airy.
Yes.
And it is, I just happen to have an art show there right
Okay.
now. So I am showing all of East Oak Lane paintings, and it happens that the house that we used to live in East Oak Lane was built in 1683.
Oh, wow.
But it's well known for being the British outpost headquarters in 77, but also that George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and Peggy Shippen were there at a party.
Oh, nice.
And William Wilson owned the house, and he was the procurer, so there must have been some communication
Oh, sure, definitely.
between those supplies and what he got for George Washington.
Probably, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the British overseer of the prison halls was a Joshua Loring.
Okay.
And there's a song, Battle of the Kegs. And one of the lines is, Sir William he snug as a flea, lay all this time snoring, nor dreamed of harm, if he lay snug in bed with Mrs. Loring.
Yeah, she did quite a bit on her part to
Yeah.
handle the men, yes.
Yeah. Lively.
Yes, yes,
Popular woman.
yes.
Yes.
I was a couple of minutes late, so I'm sorry if I missed
Yeah.
it, but what prompted your interest in this subject?
Primarily its proximity to where Cold Spring Village is today,
Okay.
and also the fact that I just happen to love American history, obviously, and Revolutionary War history. Basically, my love of history goes back to being a small child. One of my earliest memories, this is the Revolutionary War, but is watching the documentary series The World at War with Laurence Olivier with my father when I was like 5 or 6 years old. Throughout my Coast Guard career, my wife describes my Coast Guard career as the colonial tour of North America. I was stationed in Boston, I was stationed in Yorktown, I was stationed all up and down the East Coast in areas where the Revolutionary War took place, where colonial history took place, and I can pretty much attest that if you've ever been to the Tidewater area where Yorktown and Jamestown are, if you've ever been there in the summertime, you will know full well why most of the colonists died. Because it's miserable. But yeah, the Coast Guard actually has a base in Yorktown. I was stationed there for 5 years. You gotta drive through the battlefield every single day to get to the base. So that's part of my interest.
Thank you.
Yep.
Were there Native Americans down there during the Revolutionary War?
During the Revolutionary War, there may have been some. Basically what ends up happening with the native population in the area is that slowly but surely, as they started selling land to the European settlers, they kind of started moving north and west slowly. Sometimes they became part of the population. They basically assimilated. There's a few instances of some of them becoming slaves in the area, but by and large, by the time of the American Revolution, they had mostly moved up into Gloucester and Salem County. There was a reservation there for a short period of time, and they eventually all started moving west out to Oklahoma and parts of Canada. So by this time, there's really not a whole lot of native tribes still living in the area. If there are any natives, they've basically been assimilated into the local population. At least that's what we know so far.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
That was
Yes.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And you're at Cold Spring Village
Yes.
too, yes?
Yes, so yeah, we're open Thursday through Sunday, 11 to 4. This weekend is actually our 4th of July Independence Day weekend. So if you show up on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, I'll be reading the Declaration of Independence in front of the Dennis Hill Inn. We have patriotic music playing throughout the course of the day, and I'll also be doing, if you, no one who wants to see us, I'll be doing this again in the afternoons at our Welcome Center.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that's wonderful, thank you so
If
much.
it's the same band that you had last year, they are fantastic.
Yes, basically we have two bands that are playing.
Fantastic.
One's called the Brass Concert. They're a 4 or 5 piece brass ensemble playing patriotic music. And then in the afternoon, it'll be the John Walter Community Band. Yeah, so they're a 45 piece group, and they do all kinds of patriotic music. So, yep.
Love it. And thank you for reminding us, so tomorrow is another America 250 event, because 250 years ago, Washington took command of the troops.
That is true, yeah,
So
exactly.
everybody should be celebrating that.
Yep.
And I'm Terry Fisher, I'm the president for the Stone Harbor Museum. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad you found out about it. Some people said website, some people said Facebook, some people said they got the email that we sent out last night. So I'm glad to hear that. We have more events coming. If you don't have one of these brochures, you need to. Our next event is gonna be next week, and we're gonna talk about World War II comes to Stone Harbor and all those memories.
The summer contest is there on the table. I
Yeah.
think
Okay.
All right,
you
yeah.
would talk about that too, please.
Absolutely. So
When is
we're
it?
we're
When is the
having,
event next week?
next week is World War II, a week from today.
They're all every Wednesday.
Oh, okay.
Week from today, 7 o'clock, World War II comes to Stone Harbor.
Okay.
And we also have a contest, if you're up for it with your family or by yourself. You can walk around the town and you can find the location of these doors. And Robin, what did they win this year?
Basically, fill it out, bring it. The idea is to get people into the museum. It is online, it's available online, and we have hard copies over here, and you come bring it back when it's filled out with the address of where you found the house or building, and put it in our little house that's over there. And it's a basket full of Stone Harbor cheer. Yes. There'll be a variety of things from stores and gift
Awesome.
certificates and that sort of thing.
That'll be great.
Yeah.
Perfect. So yes, please, and we have refreshments back there. Please have some, come back to see us. Anybody has, children, grandchildren between the ages of 2 to 12, they need to come here for our scavenger hunt. We have a terrific
And the
scavenger hunt
adult
for
one,
them.
lots of people have been doing the adult one now too.
And we do have an adult scavenger hunt too. We've just added to it. And we have a price for that too.
And also, I just want to make a point that you are welcome to become a member at Historic Cultural
Yes.
Village also.
Absolutely.
I believe it's $60 a year
And
for,
basically, we have individual, joint, family, and benefactor memberships.
Yes.
So an individual is 30, a family, individual is 30, joint is 60, family is 90. And that gets you admission to the village
it's
all
definitely
year long.
worthwhile. They have a dozen or so events all year, and it's phenomenal. And I have a fantastic website where you can find out more about Coldstream Village.
I owe my love of history to the 4th grade program at
At
Coldstream Village,
Coldstream
so
Village.
we got the curator to.
This is Katie, our new curator, and so yes.
But I started at
for you.
There you
Coldstream
go.
in 4th grade as a teacher.
And one of the nice things we're doing this year, we're trying to expand our season into the fall and the cooler months. So some of our larger events that we used to do in the middle of summer, like our car show and some things, are being moved into September and October, where it's not quite as brutally hot.
That's good. That is good. And one last plug, and I'll let you all go, get some refreshments, look around. Membership at the museum, we need our members. We're a free museum, so the way that we keep this going is by our membership. And you can pay here, you can pay online. Again, it's in our brochure. And so we have levels of membership all the way up from $50 to $5,000 or $10,000.
As much as you want to give.
As much as you want to get, we need it.
I know that feeling.
We have a mortgage still. We need it. And then we have our fabulous
Grandma-
gala
Grandma
in August 20th.
Okay.
And so that's at the Reeds. The Reeds generously gives us that every year. We're the lowest price gala on the island, and it's $150 for a ticket. Every bit of that comes to us, and so it's very much needed and appreciated. And it's a great event. You're eating and drinking at the Reeds for $150, so it's a good deal. So thank you. I hope to see you back next week for World War II.
Good.
Please come back to the training center.
I did, I did the boot camp.
We
Yeah.
went to the open house that they had.
Okay.
months
How are you,
ago.
sir?
Really terrific.
Yeah.
Really loved it.
Yeah, actually, I'm kind of, I'm the Coast Guard brat. My father's in the Coast Guard. So basically, I kind of grew up in that place. So one of my inside jokes, when I went to boot camp, I already knew everything was going to happen. Because my father had ran one more in the training
Oh, no, you're good, you're good.
Oh, great, thank you everyone for coming.